The sky wasn't just dark. It was a deep, bruised purple that seemed to press down on the earth. Eli Grant pulled his warm coat tighter, feeling the first cold drops hit the back of his neck. A storm was coming, a real mean one, and the last thing he needed was a broken fence line letting his few skinny cows wander off. He was a poor man, and his ranch showed it. The grass was thin and yellow, the dirt dry and cracked like old pottery. His small cabin, built by his father, seemed to hunch against the wind. He rode out anyway, his old horse moving slow. The rain started in earnest, a cold, driving sheet that made it hard to see. That's when he heard it. Not thunder, but a sharp crack, like a gunshot, followed by a heavy groan. Through the rain, he saw the old cottonwood tree by the dry creek bed split and fall. He almost rode on, but a flash of lightning, bright and white, lit up the land for just a second. It wasn't just a fallen tree he saw. There was color there. A deep red and a touch of blue, now smeared with mud, trapped under the thick trunk, his breath caught. People. He kicked his horse forward, heart pounding in his ears. Up close, the sight was worse. 2 young women were pinned under the heaviest part of the tree. They weren't just hurt. They were unconscious, their faces pale against the dark mud. And they were Apache. He knew it from their clothes, their long braids. A cold fear, deeper than the rain, shot through him. Trouble found a man easy out here, and this was the worst kind. Every instinct told him to ride away. His own people, and theirs were not friends. Stories of raids and battles were told by every fire. But looking at them, so still under the crushing wood, he couldn't make his feet move. They weren't warriors right now. They were just broken. He was a poor man, but his mother had raised him to be a decent one. With a curse muttered into the wind, he got to work. He tied his rope to the tree and used his horse to pull, the animal straining against the weight. The wood shifted an inch, then another. He threw his whole body into it, his boots slipping in the mud, his muscles screaming. The rain soaked him to the bone, mixing with the sweat on his face. It took forever. His hands were raw and bleeding by the time he managed to drag the first woman free. She was tall, even lying down, and solid. Lifting her onto his horse was like lifting a sack of grain, but he did it. He led the horse back to the cabin, laid her on his own bed, covered her with a blanket, and then turned and went back into the storm for the second one. By the time he got them both into the small cabin, he was more dead than alive. He built up the fire, its heat a shock against his cold skin. He used warm water and clean cloths to wipe the mud from their faces. He saw then they were sisters, he thought. They had the same strong jaw, the same proud arch to their brows. And they were bigger than any women he'd ever seen, not fat, but strong, like they'd lived a life of hard walking and hard work. Their hands were calloused, like his. He set their broken bones as best he could, using strips of wood for splints. He made a broth from his last bit of salted meat, hoping they might wake to drink it. All the while, his mind raced. What would he do when they woke? They could kill him in his sleep. Their people could come looking, see his cabin, and burn it to the ground for taking them. He had nothing of value but his life, and it felt suddenly very thin and fragile. He pulled a chair to the door, more to block the wind than anything, and sat down to keep watch. The storm raged outside, but inside there was only the sound of the fire crackling and the slow, shallow breathing of the 2 strangers in his bed. He looked at his hands, rough and cut, then at the peaceful faces of the women he'd saved. He was a poor rancher with a failing piece of land, and now he had 2 sleeping giants from a feared nation in his home. He didn't know what would come with the sunrise, but for now, he was just a man who'd done what he thought was right, waiting for the storm to pass. The first light of dawn was a pale, gray thing seeping through the cabin's single window. Eli hadn't slept. He sat stiffly in his chair, every sense stretched tight as a wire. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, and the only sounds were the drip of water from the roof and the slow, steady breathing from the bed. Then it stopped. One moment there was the rhythm of sleep. The next, a perfect, waiting silence. Eli's own breath caught in his throat. He saw the elder sister's eyes open. They were not the confused, soft eyes of someone waking in a strange place. They were dark, sharp, and instantly aware, moving from the rough wood ceiling to the door, to the window, and finally landing on him. There was no fear in that look. It was the assessment of a warrior, calculating the distance between them, the exits, the potential for threat. She moved. A quick shift of her shoulders, and winced, her hand flying to the splint on her arm. The younger sister stirred then, her eyes flashing open with the same alert intensity. For a long minute, no one spoke. The air in the small cabin felt heavy, charged like it was before a lightning strike. Eli held up his empty hands slowly, palms out. He didn't know any of their words. "You're okay," he said, his voice rough from lack of sleep. "The tree. You were under the tree." The elder sister's gaze flicked to the bandages on her leg, to the clean blanket over her, then back to his face. She said something, her voice low and musical, but the words meant nothing to him. He shook his head, a helpless gesture. She tried again, this time in something else. The words were halting, separated by long pauses. Asterisk arbol. Tree. The storm. It was Spanish, old and formal sounding, but he understood it. Relief, small and fragile, washed over him. Yes, the storm. The big cottonwood fell. "I found you." She watched his face as he spoke, listening hard. She nodded once, a short, sharp movement. She touched her own chest. "Kosa." Then she pointed to her sister. "Talasi." He understood. Names. He pointed to himself. "Eli." "Eli," she repeated, the name sounding strange in her mouth. She then spoke, mixing Spanish with gestures, painting a picture in the air. A hunting party. The sudden, furious storm. The ground turning to a river. The terrible crack of the tree. Separation dot, he listened, piecing it together. They were not lost children. They were hunters, separated from their group. He pointed to her injured arm and leg. "You need to rest. To heal." Kosa translated for Talasi, who had been watching everything with a quiet, observant frown. Talasi said something, her tone insistent. Kosa looked back at Eli. "She says we must go. Our father, he will be looking. With many men." Eli felt that cold fear again. Of course their father would come looking, and many men would not ask questions first. He swallowed. "You cannot walk. Not yet. A day, maybe 2. If your father finds you here, resting, he will understand." He hoped desperately that was true. The sisters exchanged a long look, a whole conversation passing silently between them. Finally, Kosa gave another single nod. They would stay, but it was a tense, watchful agreement. The day unfolded in a strange, quiet dance. Eli made a simple cornmeal porridge. He served it to them in his 2 only bowls. They ate, watching him eat his share from the pot. He saw their eyes take in the cabin, the bare shelves, the patched blanket on his own cot, the empty sack of flour in the corner. They saw his poverty as clearly as he saw their strength dot in the afternoon. Talasi pointed to the door, then to herself, then made a walking motion with her fingers. She wanted to go outside. Eli, after a moment's hesitation, agreed. He was not their jailer. He helped Kosa to the doorway, where she could sit in the sun, while Talasi, leaning heavily on a stick he cut for her, hobbled out into the muddy yard. Her eyes weren't on the horizon, looking for her people. They were on his land, on his few skinny cows huddled by the fence, on a young calf that stood listlessly by its mother. Talasi frowned. She spoke to Kosa, who translated. "The calf is sick." Eli sighed, a tired sound from deep in his chest. "Yes, it won't eat. It happens." Kosa spoke to her sister, who was already moving, slow but determined, toward a wild patch of growth near the water trough. Talasi picked leaves from a few different plants, crushed them in her hand, and mixed them with a little water from the trough into a sticky green paste. She hobbled over to the calf, and with a surprisingly gentle hand, smeared the paste on its nose. The calf snorted, shook its head, and then, curiously, licked its lips. A moment later, it nuzzled against its mother. Within an hour, it was feeding. Eli just stared. He had tried everything he knew. "What was that?" he asked, amazed. "Medicine," Kosa said simply. "The land provides, if you know how to ask." Later, when Eli struggled to lift a heavy broken rail back into place on the corral, grunting with the effort, Talasi shuffled over. Without a word, she braced her good shoulder against the wood. Together, they slid it into its post. Her strength, even injured, matched his own. That evening, the silence in the cabin was different. It wasn't the tense quiet of the morning. It was the quiet of shared work, of a small problem solved. They ate together again. Kosa tried to teach him the word for water in her language. He tried to teach her the word for thank you in his. They didn't quite get it right, and for the first time, he saw Talasi almost smile. As they settled for the night, Eli on his cot and the sisters on his bed, he felt a confusing mix of feelings. The danger was still out there, a shadow waiting beyond the hills. But in here, a tiny, fragile thread of understanding had been spun. They weren't just Apache women anymore. They were Kosa, who spoke 2 languages and knew how to explain things. They were Talasi, who could read the sickness in an animal and had shoulders strong enough to lift a fence rail. And he was just Eli, a poor rancher who had brought them in from the storm. The world outside was still hard and fearful, but for tonight the cabin felt, in a very strange way, like it held a small piece of peace. The peace held for 2 days. It was a strange, quiet time, like the calm in the eye of a hurricane. Eli went about his chores, but now he had shadows. Kosa, her arm bound, would sit in the sun by the cabin door, her eyes missing nothing. She taught him words for things: sky, horse, fire. Her Spanish improved with use, becoming less formal, more a tool for their simple life. Talasi was the one who moved. Though her leg pained her, she refused to sit still. She found a piece of charcoal from the fire and began drawing on a smooth, flat piece of wood Eli had. She didn't draw pictures of people or animals. She drew maps. She pointed to a rough circle for his cabin. Then with swift, sure lines, she drew the dry creek, the distant hills, the rocky outcrop to the north. She showed him where the old deer trails were, the places where the land dipped and held water longer after a rain. One morning, she pointed firmly to a spot on her map, then to the empty water barrels by the house. "Agua," she said, the Spanish word clear. "The creek's been dry for a month," Eli said, shaking his head. She made a motion of digging, then of water rising. "Not creek. Water under." She tapped the spot on the map again. Insistent, skeptical, but with nothing to lose. He took a shovel and followed her halting lead to a place he'd always considered useless. A patch of hard clay near a cluster of scrub oak. She nodded, marking the spot. He dug. The ground was tough, and sweat poured off him. After an hour, he was ready to quit. But Talasi stood there, leaning on her stick, her expression certain. He kept digging, and then the clay became damp. A few feet lower, it became mud. With a final thrust, a trickle of dark, cool water seeped into the hole. It wasn't a gushing spring, but it was water. Clean groundwater. He stared at it, then at her, his mouth open in pure astonishment. A grin, the first real one he'd seen, broke across her face. It transformed her completely. That afternoon, the mood shifted. Kosa became restless. She walked to the edge of the pasture, her good hand shielding her eyes as she scanned the western horizon. The time for healing was over. The unspoken question now hung in the air. When would their people come, and what would happen then? Eli felt the dread return, colder and heavier than before. He had grown used to their presence. The sight of Talassi showing his sick calf how to find a certain weed to eat. The sound of Kosa trying to pronounce the English word for bread. They had become people, not just problems. The thought of them leaving was a relief for his safety, but it also left a hollow feeling in the cabin. The thought of their father arriving with warriors was pure terror. He took a risk that evening. As they shared a meal of beans and the last of the cornbread, he spoke to Kosa. "Your father. Is he a harsh man?" Kosa considered the question carefully. "My father is a chief. His first duty is to his people, to protect them." She looked at Eli. "He is fair, but his heart is strong, and his anger is like a summer fire if his family is threatened." The description did not comfort Eli. On the third morning, they came. There was no warning shout, no thunder of hooves. One moment, the ranch was quiet in the pale dawn light. The next, they were just there. Silent figures on painted ponies, lined up along the ridge like statues. A dozen of them. Their faces were streaked with lines of dark paint, and the early sun glinted off rifle barrels and knife handles. The air itself seemed to freeze. Eli was feeding the chickens. He straightened up, his blood turning to ice in his veins. This was it. This was the consequence he had feared since that moment in the storm. He saw Kosa and Talassi come to the cabin doorway. They did not run out joyfully. They stood tall and still, their faces composed into masks of dignity. This was a formal moment, he realized. A meeting between a chief and the man who held his daughters. The leader, a man with a broad, serious face and hair streaked with silver, nudged his horse forward. He rode slowly down the slope, his eyes fixed on Eli. Those eyes seemed to take in everything, the poor state of the ranch. The repaired corral, the two women standing unharmed in the doorway, their injuries cleanly tended. Eli's heart hammered against his ribs. Every instinct screamed at him to run inside, to grab his rifle. But he knew that would be a death sentence for all of them. He had to stand on the small act of kindness he had done. He forced his feet to move, stepping away from the chickens, placing himself clearly in the open space between the chief and the cabin door. He was making himself the first thing the chief would reach. A silent plea. Asterisk, they are behind me. They are safe. Asterisk, he held his empty hands out to his sides, palms open. He was a poor man in worn clothes, offering nothing but his own vulnerability. The chief stopped his horse a few paces away. The other warriors fanned out behind him, a semicircle of quiet menace. The only sound was the soft snort of a horse and the distant cry of a hawk. The chief's gaze moved from Eli's face to his daughters. He spoke a single sharp word in their language. Kosa answered, her voice clear and steady, flowing with words Eli could not understand. She spoke for a long time. She pointed to her splinted arm, to Talassi's leg. She gestured to the cabin, to Eli, to the water hole that was now slowly filling with seepage. The chief listened, his face unreadable as stone. Then he looked back at Eli. His eyes were deep and intelligent, and they held a weight of years and hard decisions. He dismounted, landing on the ground with a quiet grace. He was not a young man, but he carried power in his stance. He walked toward Eli, stopping an arm's length away. The closeness was terrifying. Eli could see the lines around his eyes, the feathers woven into his hair. He held his breath. The chief spoke, his voice low and gravelly. He used Spanish, like his daughter, but his was even more solemn. "You saved the blood of my heart." He paused, letting the words sink into the silent morning. "You took them from the teeth of the storm. You gave shelter. You did not make them captives. You did not dishonor them." He said this last part as a statement, but his eyes searched Eli's, demanding the truth. Eli found his voice, though it was a dry whisper. "I only did what any man should do." The chief's head tilted slightly, as if this was an interesting, but not quite believable, answer. His eyes left Eli's face. They scanned the parched land, the thin cattle, the patched roof of the cabin. They saw the poverty, the struggle as clearly as his daughters had. He looked back at the women, seeing the calm respect in their eyes when they looked at the rancher. He turned his dark, piercing gaze back to Eli. The shocking decision was coming. Eli could feel it in the air, tighter than a drawn bowstring. The chief took a final step, closing the last distance between them. The chief stood so close Eli could see the fine cracks in his weathered skin, like the dry earth of his own field. The world had shrunk to this small circle of ground between the cabin and the silent, watching warriors. The chief's eyes were not just looking at him. They were weighing him, measuring the very substance of his soul. "You gave honor," the chief repeated, his voice a low rumble. "So honor must be returned. My people have a law, a life for a life. A debt must be paid." He paused, and Eli's mind filled with images, a gift of horses, a pile of furs, something heavy and final that would settle the account and send them on their way. But the chief continued, his hand sweeping out to take in the ranch, the dry grass, the struggling creek bed. "But a man's spirit cannot be paid for with horses. Your spirit is strong. I see it. You fought the storm for my daughters. You fight this hungry land every day." His fingers closed into a fist. "But your land is sick. It is tired. It has forgotten how to live." He leaned in, his words for Eli alone, yet carrying in the quiet. "My decision is this. The debt will be paid, but not with gifts that will be eaten or traded. We will pay with knowledge. We will pay with strength." Eli's mind couldn't grasp it. He blinked, waiting for the meaning to settle. The chief turned and spoke a command to his warriors in their own language. One by one, they dismounted. They did not lay down their weapons, but they loosened them in their sheaths. They moved not as a war party anymore, but as men arriving at a camp. They looked at the land, at the water hole, at the tasks left undone. The chief looked back at Eli. "My band will stay here. For one cycle of the moon, we will show you the old water songs of this place. We will show your dirt how to remember its strength. Together, we will make this ground breathe again. This is the payment. This is the debt." Eli felt the ground tilt under his feet. It was not an offer. It was a declaration. Cooperation? Between a white rancher and an Apache band? In this territory, it was more than unheard of. It was dangerous madness. Neighbors 30 miles away would hang him first and ask questions later if they saw this. His own people's fear was a kind of fuel, quick to ignite. He looked past the chief to Kosa and to Lassi. They were watching their father, their faces solemn, but with a glint of something else approval. They knew this man. They trusted his judgment, even when it was this shocking. "Your people." "My people?" Eli stammered, the words feeling useless. They will not understand. The chief nodded, as if he had expected this. Understanding is a slow river. Survival is a today's sun. You kept my family alive under today's sun. Now we help your family. He gestured to the land, the cattle, live under the next sun and the sun after that. We do not need their understanding. We need only to do the work. He walked away then, toward his daughters, ending the discussion. The plan was set in stone. The first hours were a tense, silent ballet. The Apache men moved with a quiet purpose. One, an older man with eyes that missed nothing, walked to the seepage hole Talassi had found. He grunted, nodded, then pointed to a spot a few yards away. Two younger warriors began digging there with a speed and skill that left Eli breathless. They were not just digging. They were channeling, guiding the hidden water. Another man examined Eli's few bony cows. He made a clicking sound with his tongue, shook his head, and then moved to the edge of the pasture where a tough, wiry grass grew. He began cutting handfuls of it, bringing it to the animals, who ate it with an eagerness they'd never shown for Eli's hay. Eli just stood for a long time, feeling utterly useless in his own home. He was the stranger here. This was their world, and they were reading it like a book he'd never learned to open. It was Talassi who broke him out of his stupor. She limped over, carrying 2 wooden buckets. She thrust one into his hands and pointed to the new hole the men were digging, which was already showing more water than the first. "Work," she said, her voice firm. "Not watch, work." So he worked. He carried water for the men mixing mud to repair a crumbling wall of the corral. He fetched tools when a pointed glance asked for them. He worked alongside them, not speaking, just moving in rhythm with their labor. At midday, Kosa directed the cooking. She used some of Eli's meager supplies beans, a little salt, but she added wild onions and a spicy herb one of the warriors brought from his pouch. The smell that rose from the pot was rich and unfamiliar, and when Eli ate it, the food seemed to fill him more than any meal he'd had in months. By afternoon, a kind of uneasy rhythm had been found. The chief, who Eli learned was called Taza, walked the entire boundary of the ranch with him. He did not talk about borders or fences. He talked about the land. He showed Eli how the way the grass leaned showed the direction of the strongest winds, and where to plant a row of bushes as a windbreak. He pointed to bird nests, explaining what their locations said about water and insects. "You fight the land like it is an enemy," Taza said finally, stopping on a small rise. "It is not an enemy. It is a relative who is sick. You do not fight a sick relative. You learn what medicine they need." As the sun began to lower, painting the sky in colors of fire, Eli looked over his ranch. It was the same place, and yet it was not. There was a new water channel, already trickling. A section of fence stood straight and strong for the first time in years. The air hummed with the quiet activity of people who knew how to listen to the earth. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach. The outside world was still real. But as he watched Chief Taza speak softly to his warriors, as he saw Kosa smile at something Talassi signed, a new feeling, fragile as a seedling, pushed up through the cracks in his fear. It wasn't trust, not yet. It was the first faint shadow of possibility. The shocking decision was not an ending. It was a terrifying, bewildering, and utterly new beginning. The moon rose thin and sharp, a silver blade in the vast Texas sky. Inside Eli's cabin, the world had been turned inside out. He lay on his cot by the door, listening to the soft breathing of the Apache family now sharing his space. Kosa and Talassi were on his bed. Chief Taza and his wife, a quiet woman with hands as skilled as her daughter's, slept on bedrolls near the fireplace. The air was thick with the smell of crushed herbs, smoke, and the unfamiliar scent of the high blankets they used. Eli couldn't sleep. His mind was a storm of worries. He thought of Old Man Henderson, his nearest neighbor, a hard day's ride away. If Henderson saw this, he'd raise a posse before you could spit. Eli pictured the flames, the gunfire. He'd be called a traitor, a fool. The law here was written in fear, not fairness. A floorboard creaked. In the dim firelight, Eli saw Taza sit up. The chief's eyes found his in the dark. Without a word, Taza rose, wrapped a blanket around his shoulders, and stepped silently outside. It was an invitation. Eli followed. The night was cool, the land washed in moonlight. Taza stood looking over the sleeping camp, where his warriors were bedded down near the corral. "You hear the land sleeping," Taza said, not turning around. "But you do not hear it resting. You hear your own worry. It is loud in your head." Eli didn't deny it. "My people, they won't see this as a debt being paid. They'll see it as a threat." Taza nodded slowly. "And my people see a lone white man not as a neighbor, but as the edge of a wave that has washed away our hunting grounds. Fear is a seed that grows in all soils, Eli." He finally looked at him. "But a man can choose which seeds to water." The work began at first light. It was no longer a tense ballet, but a shared labor. Eli learned to watch and listen. A young warrior showed him how to weave willow branches into a gate that was strong but flexible, that wouldn't warp in the sun. An older woman, Taza's sister, took him to the dry creek bed. She didn't look for surface water. She looked for stones, for the way the sand was packed. She chose a spot and said, "Dig deep here. Not for today's water, for tomorrow's." They dug a deep, narrow hole that by afternoon began to seep cool. Clear water, a true well. Eli's hands blistered and calloused in new places. He ate meals that were strange and wonderful: flat bread cooked on a stone, stews with roots he didn't recognize. He learned words. A deal for wood. Two for water. He taught them hammer and nail. Laughter, when it came, was usually over these mispronounced words. A sudden sound that would startle the birds and then make everyone smile. One afternoon, the danger they feared rode over the hill. It wasn't a posse, but two dusty cowhands from the Henderson ranch, driving a few stray steers. They pulled up short, their hands drifting toward their rifles as they took in the scene. Apache men working on Eli's fence. Women tending a cooking fire, children playing near the new well. Eli's heart slammed against his ribs. He walked forward alone, his hands visible. The lead cowhand, a grim man named Carl, spat on the ground. "What in God's name is this, Grant? You got a whole damn village here." Before Eli could form an answer, Chief Taza was beside him. He did not stand aggressively, but with a calm authority. He looked at the steers, then at Carl. "You are missing a red calf with a torn ear," Taza said in his careful Spanish. "It is by the rocks near the place where 3 pine trees grow together, half a morning's ride west. It has an injured foot, but will live if you tend it." Carl's mouth hung open. He knew that place. The sheer, useless kindness of the information disarmed him completely. He stared from Taza to Eli, his anger crumbling into confusion. We'll look there," he muttered. They turned their horses and rode off, looking back over their shoulders in disbelief. Taza watched them go. "Fear is weakened by a gift it does not expect," he said simply. The moon cycle waned. The ranch was transforming. Green shoots appeared in the repaired pasture. The water flowed clean and steady. The cattle grew sleek. On the final morning, Eli stood with Taza on the small rise. The chief pointed. "See where the grass is darkest? The land remembers now. You must listen. It will tell you when it is thirsty, when it is tired. Eli saw not just grass, but the shape of his future. It was no longer a desperate fight, but a conversation. "I don't know how to thank you," Eli said, his voice thick. "You already did," Taza said. "You saved my daughters. We have made your land strong. The debt is gone. What is left is not a debt. It is a—" He searched for the word. "A thread. A thin thread between our families. It is strong if you remember." They left as quietly as they had come, fading into the landscape from which they'd appeared. The cabin felt enormous and empty. But when Eli walked his land, he saw them everywhere. In the clever willow gate, in the deep, cool well, in the healthy shine of his animals. A week later, riding the line, he found a carefully wrapped deer hide tied to his fence post. Inside was a perfect obsidian knife and a handful of the special grass seed his cows loved best. No note was needed. The story, of course, spread. It warped in the telling. In town, some said poor Eli Grant had been held captive by Apaches and was lucky to be alive. Others whispered he'd made a devil's bargain. Old Man Henderson just shook his head and said Grant's place was suddenly the greenest spot in the county, and he couldn't figure it. Eli didn't try to explain. The truth was too big and too quiet for words. He was no longer just a poor rancher. He was a man who had stood in a circle of unlikely help. His wealth was not in cattle or land, but in the knowledge that kindness could echo in ways too vast to predict. The thread Taza spoke of was real. It stretched across the hills, connecting him to a family, to a way of seeing the world not as something to be conquered, but as a relative to be healed. And on quiet nights, when the wind sounded like a distant song, he knew he was no longer alone.